Ready? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Hi, how's everyone doing? Does everyone have a seat? Does everyone have a chair? We have enough tonight? Fantastic. Okay. Well, again, I'm Jessamy Jones. I'm the executive director here at the Springfield Museum of Art. It is such a pleasure to see all of you. I think almost all of you have been to most or several or a few of these conversations. And it has been such a pleasure to have these moments to be able to come together as a community and to be able to talk about civics and civic engagement. So 6, right? This is our sixth. That's amazing. So it's kind of incredible to think back to the first one and how much has changed over that time. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for being engaged citizens. And it's a pleasure to have you here. And it's been such an honor to be able to have these conversations here at the Springfield Museum of Art. I would like to just share a reminder that all of the resources from these conversations can be found on Wittenberg's website. If you go to Wittenberg and you look and you search for the Hagen Center, there is a drop-down menu under the Hagen Center that shows these community conversations, and all the resources are there. So the PowerPoint presentations and links to the videos, all of these have been recorded. So if you'd like to rewatch any of these, or if you would like to share them with anyone, they can be there. And Chad, we have had several thousand views of those videos. I think you were saying at one point that each video has been viewed, I think, over 1,000 times. So I think that is a huge testament to the conversations that we're having here. Without any further ado, I'd like to share this with Dr. Rob Baker. He is here for our final conversation, and it's all around gerrymandering, correct? Okay, sure to be a lively topic. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for joining us all of these weeks.
Is this working? Yeah, okay, it is. Welcome. Thanks for coming again. And I just want to acknowledge our sponsors again. There are logos on the table that are listed there. So please note the sponsors. We wouldn't have been able to do it without them. And I would like to also acknowledge the little steering committee that we had put together sort of as an ad hoc committee to try to figure out how we might do this. Tracy Tackett, Carrie Pedraza, Jessamy here at the Springfield Museum of Art, as well as Patrick Wicker and Chad, who's been doing the AV stuff for us. I want to especially thank Carrie because, we met sort of, is this an idea that might work? And Carrie said, I think it's a great idea. Let me see if we can pull this together with some sponsors. And she was the one behind all the scenes, getting the sponsors pulled together to get this done. And I really appreciate all the work that she has done in that regard. And I'm going to have her come up at the end of this and have her say a little bit more about the sponsors, if she wouldn't mind, and have her be acknowledged in that regard. So this is our 6th and final one. How many of you have been to all of them? A number of you I know have. So thank you for that. That's great. I have to say, it's been interesting after each some information about that, but I want you all to have a conversation at your tables in terms of what you think about gerrymandering as well. So let's get right into the conversation. I'm going to talk about redistricting, reapportionment, malapportionment, and gerrymandering. So here are some questions to start off with at your table. Very basic. What are these things? What's redistricting? What is reapportionment? What's malapportionment? What is gerrymandering? And then, just so we're on the same page here, how many U.S. House seats does Ohio have in the U.S. Congress? How many seats are in the Ohio General Assembly House? And how many seats are in the Ohio Senate? So, kind of get those answers going, all right? Good luck. All right, let's reconvene. I'm sure we can get the answers as we go along here. But before we proceed, I would like to welcome anybody who is just joining us. We had some audio technical difficulties. We're talking about gerrymandering tonight, and we are just discussing some questions that I posed for the group. So welcome. If you just joined us, sorry about the technical difficulties. So what is redistricting? What is that? It's not that. Yeah, Mike.
Changing the boundaries of congressional districts or
Yeah.
state house districts.
Yeah, changing the district boundaries as populations shift. Good. What is reapportionment? What is that? Sometimes redistricting and reapportionment are used interchangeably. They're technically not the same at all. Bob?
Is it reapportionment when the population of a state changes and instead of having a certain number, 10 representatives, they now have 9 because their population went down?
Yes.
And that was that every census?
That's every census, every 10 years. And that applies to Congress, to the U.S. House.
Yeah.
When we have to change the number of representatives in each state based on population shifts. So that means we need to reapportion, because there are only 435 seats in the U.S. House, and as population shifts occur, we need to make sure that the states are represented based on population, and so the reapportionment has to take place. And along with reapportionment then comes redistricting, so the maps have to be withdrawn, so that are redrawn. So that is why it's often confused as sort of the same thing, but they're separate. What is malapportionment? Yes, sir. You're in the back. Here's a mic coming your way.
Thank you. I think malapportionment has to do with the different numbers of people in the district. So
Yes.
if you had a 10,000 person district and a 100,000 person district, that's kind of out of balance.
Correct. That's when the districts are significantly different in population size, so they're malapportioned. And I'm going to start talking about malapportioned and give you some history of that, because that leads us then into gerrymandering. What is gerrymandering? Jeff, were you going to say something? No. Okay, just scratch it. Gerrymandering? Yeah, Tom, what's gerrymandering? Here comes a mic. Here's a mic right here, Tom.
I believe it's changing of the boundaries of a congressional district based on trying to achieve a political aim,
Okay.
to eliminate some or add some to direct the vote.
Okay. That's pretty good. Gerrymandering generally is this, though. It's the drawing of legislative district lines in order to help or hurt one group over another. It could be a party, it could be a racial group, actually. So gerrymandering occurs racially, it also occurs in a partisan fashion to help or hurt one group over another. Typically, we think of gerrymandering as a way to sort of help a party, right? The people who are doing it are trying to help themselves. But for reasons that I'll get into, there are instances of negative and positive racial gerrymandering, which we'll talk about briefly so that you understand that, okay? Let's kind of get into this a little bit. Talk about malapportionment first, because I think this is interesting to think about how this precedes some of the gerrymandering challenges that we're facing today. Gerrymandering has been around for a long time, but if we go to the 1960s and we look at the state legislatures, not Congress, but the state legislatures, there was a heavy rural bias in state legislatures because they didn't really draw their districts every 10 years. Populations would shift. Mostly we had an urbanization occur in the United States, so people started moving to the cities, but they never redrew the districts, and so we ended up with significantly malapportioned districts in the state legislatures because of that. For example, in Vermont, we're talking about as of the 1960s, Vermont had not reapportioned since 1733. Connecticut since 1818, Mississippi since 1890. I mean, population shifts had occurred for decades and they hadn't redrawn districts. Maryland, for example, as of 1960 census, they had a district that had just over 15,000 people in it compared to the one in Baltimore that had just under 500,000 people. 31 times larger, yet still only one representative in the Maryland legislature from that county compared to the rural county. In Tennessee, in Moore County, 2,300 people roughly lived in that county versus Shelby County, which is Memphis, 312,000 people. They each still only had one representative. You can obviously see a problem here, right? This is egregious malapportionment. New Hampshire, one township had three citizens living there, 3 residents, but they still had a representative in the general court, which is what they call their state legislature, while another township of over 3,000 people, they also had 1 representative. Utah, the smallest House district, had 191 residents, period, whereas the largest one in Salt Lake City had 81,000, so 424 times larger than the smaller one. I mean, this is egregious malapportionment. That's what we mean by malapportionment, and the legislature simply had not done anything about that. So these malapportioned legislatures were challenged as an unconstitutional violation of the Equal Protection Clause, that this is simply not fair that people were being represented in such an unequal fashion, in such a malapportioned fashion. In 1946, it was the first time that anybody tried to challenge this malapportionment, and this involved Illinois. They hadn't reapportioned since 1901. The Supreme Court of the United States said, nah, this is non-justiciable. This is a political issue. States get to decide what they want to do. We're not going to, quote, jump into the political thicket. All right? So they said no. States can do this if they want. We're not going to do anything about it. By 1960, with these egregious examples that I just showed you, a number of other states began to challenge, a number of citizens around these states began to challenge these malapportionment issues. And in Tennessee, in a landmark case, Baker versus Carr, that malapportionment example I just showed you was challenged as an equal protection violation. And the Supreme Court said, yes, apportionment is a legislative concern, but if a constitutional question is raised, then we'll look at it. So in other words, they opened the door here to look at whether or not this was a constitutional problem. And they said relief can be provided if the apportionment has violated the Constitution. And then they finally said arbitrary apportionments do violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So the first time ever in 1962, the Supreme Court said this is unconstitutional. It's unfair. It violates the Equal Protection Clause. Then we had 2 years later in Reynolds versus Sims, the Alabama State Senate was significantly malapportioned, and they were using the bicameralism argument. Every county had X number of senators regardless of the size of the county. And Alabama said to the Supreme Court when it got challenged on this, hey, what about the U.S. Senate? It's the same thing there. We're just doing that. Okay? And it was a kind of an interesting and persuasive argument for many people. But the court said, no, both houses of state legislatures need to be apportioned fairly. And so they rejected this long-standing bicameralism argument that state senates or upper houses could be malapportioned similar to the U.S. Senate, right? Every state has 2 senators. In fact, Earl Warren's famous quote was, legislators represent people, not trees. So stop it, right? Reapportion your state legislatures, including both houses. Then in Westbury versus Sanders in 1964, Georgia congressional districts were challenged. Here's an interesting example here. The Atlanta district, each of these districts have 1 member in the U.S. House, right? Atlanta district, just under 900,000 people. The smallest rural district, just under 275,000. The average was about 394. That was challenged as unconstitutional, as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause for congressional districts to be malapportioned. And the Supreme Court said, yes, that is true. Yeah, that is unconstitutional. And of course, Hugo Black's famous quote, and it's a gendered quote, but anyway, he said, one man's vote should be equal to every other person's vote, right? So that began this very important constitutional justification for looking at districting and looking at the way the districts are drawn to think about fairness, okay? So let's move along here. What are the criteria then that legislators should use when they draw these districts? So in the context of these malapportionment cases, the Supreme Court handed down some rules, if you will, for how districts ought to be drawn. And there are 4 of them: compactness, contiguity, fewest number of split jurisdictions, and population equity. So districts need to be compact as possible so that it's basically fair for all representatives and members of the state legislature who are elected. You know, they're basically traveling the same amount of distance to represent their people, okay? You shouldn't have these long, really crazy districts. Contiguity means that district lines should be contiguous. You can't have, for example, a circle as a district, and then in the middle of that circle you've got another circle that represents another district. Or that second circle would be a non-contiguous district. That's not constitutional. You need to split as few jurisdictions as possible. That means counties, cities, townships. There's this understanding, there's a general sense of community and sameness to a community. So try not to split jurisdictions. Now, big cities have to be split up, right? But to the extent possible, try to keep people who live in the same city in the same representative district. And then population equity. Basically, districts need to be about the same size population. The Supreme Court allows for about a 10% variation in population. So those are the criteria for drawing district lines.
I'm sorry, is that state districts then?
Both state and congressional districts, okay? So who draws the lines? That's an interesting question, and that's going to get us to some of the discussion about the issue that's on the ballot this November for Ohio. States originally were allowed to decide how their House members would be chosen in the U.S. House. A lot of them used statewide elections, and if they had 4 members in the House, they were apportioned 4 members, they just had a statewide election, maybe 10 people ran, the top 4 people got chosen. Some states chose that. A number of other states chose single-member districts, so one person would be elected from each of these districts. In 1842, and then reaffirmed in 1967, Congress mandated single-member districts for Congress, for congressional districts, okay? States can decide what they want to do for their own districts. Most of them use single-member districts today. So there are some multi-member districts out there, and I want to talk about that towards the end of the session tonight. But states are responsible then for drawing the lines for both state legislatures and congressional district lines. Who does it? Basically 3 options out there. One of them is state legislatures. 39 of the state legislatures draw congressional districts. 34 of the state legislatures draw their state legislative district lines. So the vast majority of this is done by state legislatures themselves. Political commissions, 2 political commissions draw congressional districts and 7 draw state legislative districts. That's Ohio. Ohio's one of those right now, okay? Independent commissions made up of non-politicians, citizens. 9 states use that for congressional districts, and they also use it for state legislative districts. So those are the 3 options that we have out there. And the key point I want to make is this. Our primary election system of single-member district system, of electing one person from each district, exacerbates the negative effects of gerrymandering, because only one person can get elected from that district. So if that's how we're selecting people, and we can draw districts to help people, the single-member concept exacerbates the effects of gerrymandering. So more proportional systems or more independent commission systems kind of work against that problem of single-member districts. And how is that? Well, let's talk about that. So here are some questions for your table. Number 1, seriously, what are some arguments in favor of gerrymandering? You need to come up with some. And then, what are some arguments against partisan gerrymandering. Because partisan gerrymandering is done all over the place. So there must be an argument in favor of it, or more than one. What would they be? And then what are the arguments against? So talk amongst yourselves, okay?
Okay, let's read the feed. By the way, how many U.S. House members does Ohio have?
15. How many members of the House in the Ohio General Assembly? 99. How many in the Ohio Senate? 33. Okay. So each of those U.S. House members, General Assembly members in the House and Senate, each of them represents a single member district. Okay? So each of those districts can be gerrymandered. What are some arguments in favor of partisan? I've talked about partisan gerrymandering here. If you want to talk a little bit about racial, that's okay. But what have you come up with? What are some advantages of partisan gerrymandering? Anybody want to offer an answer? Yeah, Volker, here. Come in your way as a mic.
I can have all my friends with me, as many as possible.
Okay, right. You can create a district just of your friends. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. Other advantages. That'd be great for him. You know, he'd love that district. Other examples. Back here.
Oh yeah, one reason is you would have less turnover in elections of people who win, so you'd have more seniority and more experience.
Sure. As long as the person stays running for re-election, they can probably get elected over and over again. Fair enough.
This may not be partisan, but we talked about the fact that some populations feel that they would be underrepresented in the legislature, whether it's rural districts or minority districts. If it's not apportioned properly, then they lose their ability to have representation.
Yeah. Gerrymandering helps them, right? Yeah. Was there an answer here? Okay, same thing. Any other things you came up with or possibilities? John has an answer here.
Possibly grouping together economic interests.
Sure.
So, in Ohio, we've got Great Lakes shipping, coal mining, well, used to.
Don't mess with Claudia.
Yeah. So, keeping politicians in power that will help those interests and not divide votes among, like, agriculture and shipping or things like that.
So you could draw them around economic interests. Any other advantages? I'm thinking of one that, over here. Thinking of one you haven't come up with yet, technically, I guess.
it costs less to conduct elections, because if they're not competitive, then not as much money has to be spent.
Yeah. So you're assuming that gerrymandered districts are not competitive. Fair enough. We'll get to that. Yeah, but it would make elections less expensive because nobody's probably going to challenge you and don't need to spend any money. In fact, just get your name on the ballot, you're good to go, right? What are the disadvantages or arguments against partisan gerrymandering? I would assume by what you just said that elections are not competitive. Is that a disadvantage? Yes. Okay. Any other disadvantages? Right here, Karen.
And because those districts are not competitive, it tends to give you the most extreme candidate out of the pool of that party.
Good. Great chance that we end up with more extreme candidates from the parties that are benefited by whatever district we're talking about. Absolutely. Here's an advantage that you didn't technically come up with. It allows a party to maintain control of the state even if they're in a minority. Okay? That's an advantage for that party, right? All right, what are some other disadvantages that you can come up with? Any other disadvantages besides what we just heard? John, go ahead. Here's a mic coming your way.
I mean, just a general sense of disenfranchisement among voters, that they're not being heard and that they may not be heard in a generation.
And what happens then to voters who are disenfranchised or feel that way, feel like they're not heard? What do they tend to do? What do we know? They not vote, they drop out, they disengage, right? Yeah, right here. Hal?
One of the previous slides you talked about what was supposed to be like compactness.
Mm-hmm.
What we see is a lack of compactness now. What we see is
Absolutely.
districts drawn way out of compact.
We do. Egregious violations of the compactness criterion. Absolutely. Let's move along here and talk a little bit more about gerrymandering. So there are different ways of gerrymandering. There's splintering and cracking, or packing and cracking. Okay, you can pack a particular group into one district and give it that district, but then you can save the other districts or the majority of the other districts for your own party, right? So that's called packing. So you figure out where all the Republicans are. If you're Democrats, you're trying to gerrymander the maps, and you put the Republicans in a few districts, you pack them all together, and you take all the rest of them. That's packing. Cracking is, again, figuring out where your opposition is located and then cutting them up so that they don't have a majority of voters in the district that they're in. There's racial gerrymandering versus partisan gerrymandering. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on racial, but you need to understand that that's there. Negative racial gerrymandering is absolutely unconstitutional. It is not constitutional to draw legislative district lines to hurt a minority group. That was declared unconstitutional in this case in 1960, Comillion versus Lightfoot. It's really interesting. The city of Tuskegee, Alabama, governed by a white city council, redrew its city boundaries to make sure that black residents lived outside the city and therefore had no power in the city elections. That was negative racial gerrymandering in the drawing of actually the city boundaries, and the court said, no, you can't do that. Negative racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Positive racial gerrymandering, however, has been constitutional for a period of time. Starting in 1986, in a case there that you see, the Supreme Court actually said state legislatures need to draw legislative district lines to help minorities that typically had been underrepresented in their state legislature and in Congress. So after that decision, state legislatures had to redraw lines after the 1990 census, and many of them in the South who were covered by the Voting Rights Act, I don't want to get too technical here, they tried this. They actually tried to do some positive racial gerrymandering to draw what are called majority-minority districts, districts that have a majority of the population from a minority group so that they could elect somebody from their minority group if they wanted to. A number of them did that. White voters then sued in North Carolina and Texas, arguing That was an unconstitutional use of race in drawing of legislative district lines, and in Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court agreed and struck down positive racial gerrymandering as unconstitutional. So racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional in both ways, although the Supreme Court has said racial groups do need to be taken into consideration when lines are drawn. But you can see the confusion there, right? There is some confusion about how that's supposed to be handled. But I want to get to the effect of gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering in particular. And the major concern is what we call wasted votes, okay? Republicans have been really successful at gerrymandering at the state legislative level because they have won a number of state legislative races over the years, and then they've gerrymandered the districts to make it so that they continue to win across the states. In 2012, for example, in the congressional elections, the Democrats got nationwide 50.6% of the vote for House seats, but they only got 46.2% of the seats in the House. So that gives you some idea of the existence of some partisan gerrymandering there. There were some wasted votes that were given to the Democrats that didn't translate into seats. Does that make sense? So how do we deal with this? Well, one suggestion is called the compactness index, and I'm not going to get too technical here, but it's an idea that was developed by Christopher Ingraham to try to look at the area of a district to make sure that it was compact and it didn't waste votes. And in the 113th Congress, which was after 2012, he calculated compactness indices for all the congressional districts, and he found that the higher the score, the more gerrymandered the district was, the less compact it was. Back to your point, right? The less compact it was, the more likely it is being gerrymandered. And you can click on that and look at all these districts if you want to. I'm not going to do that right now. But again, this is available at the Hagen Center if you want to check it out, okay? Hagen Center website. Reduction of competition. You mentioned this, right? This is a significant problem that most people think of when they think of partisan gerrymandering. Is it true that it reduces competition? Well, findings have been somewhat mixed in the scholarly literature, but mostly there has been a positive effect here of racial gerrymandering. It positively helps the party that's gerrymandering. So it makes the districts less competitive. Commission-drawn districts, though, independent commission-drawn districts, are correlated with lower levels of partisanship in legislator voting behavior. So once they get into Congress or the state legislature and they've come from a map that has been drawn by citizen commission, they are less partisan-oriented and less extreme than you see in a gerrymandered map and the legislators that result from that. Commission-drawn plans have also survived judicial challenges better than legislative-drawn plans. And if you know of the history in Ohio, we've had all kinds of court problems with maps that have been produced through the partisan plan. Commission plans also increase the chances that incumbents will face stronger challengers, and that in and of itself produces more competitive election when you've got stronger challengers. And by that we mean people with some experience in government, people who are have better name recognition, et cetera, et cetera. That would be what we mean by a stronger challenger. My former student, Abby Reynolds, who graduated in 2013, looked at this question of competitiveness to see whether or not partisan-drawn districts were less competitive than independent commission-drawn districts. And she looked at 26 states, about half the states, and what she found, looking at margin of victory, was that in the districting process, partisan races had a larger margin of victory and were less competitive than nonpartisan or bipartisan districting processes. So she found pretty solid evidence that partisan districting processes, partisan gerrymandering, if you will, produced larger margins of victory, less competitive elections. What has the court said about partisan gerrymandering? I told you what they said about racial gerrymandering, what they said about malapportionment. Let's look at partisan gerrymandering. The first time they dealt with it was in 1986 in a case in Indiana where the Republicans gerrymandered the map of the Indiana legislature. They packed a bunch of the Democrats into Indianapolis, and they cracked the Democrats up in Fort Wayne. And the Democrats won 52% of the statewide vote, but they only got 43% of the seats. So this was challenged as a clear partisan gerrymander, violation of the 14th Amendment. Supreme Court said, nah, that's a political issue. You guys figure that out. So they declined to declare partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional. Same thing in 2004, Wyeth versus Jubal-Ira. This was in Pennsylvania, where the Republicans also gerrymandered the districts there. And the author of the opinion was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the opinion said this: there's no discernible and manageable standard for adjudicating political gerrymandering claims. We just can't figure out what would be a good gerrymander and what would be an unconstitutional gerrymander. So they just declined to do anything about it. But the key here was they sent a signal. If you can come up with something that will help us figure this out, to say this is a bad one and this is a good one, we'll listen to you. People got busy then, okay, including a former Wittenberg grad named Barry Burden, who first went off to LSU after his Ohio State PhD, got recruited to Harvard, was there for a while, and ended up at Wisconsin-Madison, where he is now. And he wrote, along with a number of other scholars, Dick remembers Barry, right? A number of other scholars wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court suggesting a way to figure this out. But before I get to that, as a little teaser, right? In this case, SCOTUS unanimously upheld Arizona's independent congressional redistricting plan. They've got an independent districting plan. Supreme Court said that's great. It was challenged, but Supreme Court said no, that's okay. In Whitford versus Gill, then, this dealt with a Wisconsin gerrymander. The Democrats won majority of the statewide vote in 2012 and 2014, but Republicans won 60 out of 90 seats over the course of those two elections. So Barry Burden and others suggested an efficiency gap, and that this might be a respectable standard for how the court might sort out what was an okay map and what was unconstitutional. And it was Justice Kennedy who said, hey, if you give us an idea, back in the 2004 case, we might be able to use it. So the efficiency gap was proposed as a way of looking at seats versus votes. The idea is if you have a proportion of seats that is for your party that is fairly equal to the proportion of the vote you got, that would be a fairly efficient election. If you have an inefficient election, you had way more votes than you got seats. That would be an inefficient election. So the question was, how big of a gap is it between seats and votes? And the larger the gap, the idea is that would be more of an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. That, I don't want to get into the weeds on it. That's the idea behind the efficiency gap. Does that make sense? So we were pretty excited about that, because not only was this something that political scientists were proposing and legal scholars, but the court seemed to be interested in maybe doing something about it. Then, in the Gill case, they stayed that and decided not to do anything about it, but would reconsider it with two other cases in Maryland and North Carolina, which were combined in the Rucho versus Common Cause case in 2019. And darn it, they refused to declare partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional once again. And that's where we are. It is not unconstitutional to engage in partisan gerrymandering from the Supreme Court of the United States perspective. States can do things differently, though, including state Supreme Courts. They interpret their own constitution and decide whether or not a state map is unconstitutional. And in North Carolina in 2021, the NC Supreme Court struck down North Carolina's map, congressional map, arguing that was a violation of the North Carolina Constitution. The Supreme Court of North Carolina after a partisan switch in the election, and the North Carolina court switched from Democrat control to Republican control, then they upheld the map, and it went forward. North Carolina is one of the most egregiously gerrymandered districts or maps in the country. And then finally in 2023, just last year, the Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. Constitution's elections clause, which deals with states drawing their maps, does not allow state legislatures to ignore their own state constitution in order to make rules for their state legislatures, but also when making rules for their federal elections. So they rejected this weird thing called the independent state legislatures theory that North Carolina was pushing, saying, we're the state legislature, we get to decide what we want to do. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't. Not if it violates your Constitution or the U.S. Constitution. So let's talk about Ohio and kind of wrap things up and get to some further discussion for the next 10 minutes or so. So remember in 2012, when we were asked to vote on a ballot issue, that would have created a 12-member citizen commission to draw state legislative and congressional maps. It failed miserably. Remember that? That was the result there, 37 to 63. So in 2015, the League of Women Voters came back to us with another bipartisan commission, not an independent commission, to draw state legislative districts only. This is 2015. This passed by about 72% of the vote. So we put in place a bipartisan commission to draw our state legislative maps. That was in 2015, the ballot issue then. More details there that you can read on the slides, or you can go to the website and check it out. But basically, it replaced what was a 5-member redistricting panel that included, by law, those elected officials with the 7-member panel that we have now. In 2018, I'm not going to read all that, but in 2018, we also were confronted with a ballot issue for congressional maps, right? Same thing. Same bipartisan commission would draw the congressional maps. We approved it. 75% of the voters approved that. Next time we had to deal with that was the 2020 census, and I think many of you know that we had all kinds of problems with that, right? And I've listed them there. You can read them. We had maps that were proposed. The commission was split. The Supreme Court declared 3 times the maps that they put forward as unconstitutional gerrymanders. They ended up using the final map that was drawn and declared unconstitutional. That's the map that we used in 2022 for our election. That's where we are, right? We're under the existence right now of representatives who are elected on the basis of what the Supreme Court of Ohio said was an unconstitutional gerrymander. I don't know if you knew that. Yes. Yeah, good. You knew that. So we have an issue on the ballot this fall, issue 1. And it would create a bipartisan, not an independent, but a bipartisan 15-member Citizens Commission to draw congressional district maps and state legislative maps. 9 of the 15 people would be required to approve the maps, including out of that 9, at least 2 Democrats who are on the commission, at least 2 Republicans, and at least 2 independents. Okay? We can talk about how they're chosen and all that if you want to, but you can look all this up on Fair Districts. There's a website that is really good about explaining all the details of this, Fair Districts. But if they reach an impasse and they can't agree on a map, then they can rank choice voting in the case of an impasse. So maybe they've got 2 or 3 maps that they've created. By the way, citizens can present maps too. And if they get an impasse and they can't get to the 9 according to the rules here, then they'll do a ranked choice voting where each of them will take the maps and rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, and the one that gets the most votes will be the one that gets chosen for the map. The ACLU and the League of Women Voters has sued the Secretary of State LaRose, you may know, and the Ohio Ballot Board because of the misleading ballot language that the ballot board approved. This is the proposed language. ban partisan gerrymandering and prohibit the use of redistricting plans that favor one party and disfavors another. That was what was proposed. Here's what we're going to be voting on. Establish a new taxpayer-funded commission of appointees required to gerrymander the boundaries of state legislative and congressional districts to favor either of the two largest political parties in the state of Ohio. Yep, that's exactly what happened. That's why LaRose and the ballot board are being sued. They actually, the Supreme Court actually made a decision on this and required them to change a little bit of the language, but this basic language is still there. Yeah, John? The state Supreme Court, yeah. State Supreme Court ruled in this case and said essentially that language that describes what we're supposed to be voting on will stay. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that this is a problem, and it's going to confuse voters, isn't it?
Is the italics in the ballot language, or did you add that?
What?
Is the italics?
Yeah, the italics. The italics was added by me, but I took it from the source that I got it from, which was also italicized. In other words, that's the difference. We're going to ban partisan gerrymandering. No, we're going to require gerrymandering. Yeah. This is the description. This is the description. This is the ballot language that describes the ballot issue. Yep. Correct. Correct. You can read it, but what is happening is this. This is what we're asked to approve or not, but it's being described this way. Everybody with me? Yes, yes. That's what we're voting on, but it's described this way. So I'm going to suggest some other ways we can think about this and get out of this single-member district stuff, okay? Because it's exacerbating our problem of dealing with fair elections. One way that we can draw districts is simply do a soap bubble. You know when you drop a soap bubble on a counter, it spreads out? Brian Olson has a wonderful website talking about what he calls soap bubble districting, where you essentially drop a pin and let it spread out, create compact districts that way. This is, on the left, current Ohio districts, okay? On the right here would be compact districts using the soap bubble method. That's one way of thinking about it. I, however, would suggest it might be better to get out of a single-member district mindset. So one way we could do that is through multi-member districts, okay? So Florida, for example, on the left here would be all the gerrymandered single-member districts in Florida. Florida has total number of representatives in Florida in this particular case is 27, okay? So there are 27 single-member districts. Many of them are gerrymandered. This would be 4 multi-member districts on the left, on the right here. The purple one would be a district. 6 members would be elected from that district. Yellow, green, and red, those are also multi-member districts, and each one of those, because of population sizes, they would get 7 members. So you could see how potentially more than one party, and most probably more than one party, would get represented from each of these multi-member districts. Many state legislatures used to do this. They didn't have single-member districts. Yes, sir.
In that top district in Florida, there would be 7 winners?
6. 6 in that top one, and 7 in the other 3.
And how many people might be on the ballot?
As many people as might want to.
Voters might have to say, which of these 7 of these 28 guys
Right.
do I want to vote for?
Right, yeah.
That's going to be real confusing.
Perhaps. But I submit to you that more than one party is probably going to be represented in that district. Yeah, John? Yes, and that's what I want to finish up with. The other thing we could do, so John asked, do you see this going hand in hand with ranked choice voting? Absolutely. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Congress, first of all, Congress, remember, required single-member districts back in 1845 and again in 1967. They could actually repeal that requirement and let states do what they wanted to. We're required right now to have single-member congressional districts. We could have Congress repeal that, but we could also do ranked choice voting along with multi-member districts. So if we had 28 people running in a district that's going to elect 7, everybody ranked their top 7, and then we could figure out who had the most preferences in that sense. Or we could do approval voting. Everybody is on the ballot, and you just approve of whoever you want, and however many which 6 get the most approvals, they're the ones that get elected. We don't have to just do one person, right? We don't have to elect 6 people. If you get 6 people elected from that district, you get 6 votes, and you got to choose 6 different people. You don't have to do that. You can rank them. You can do approval, right? Or you could do cumulative voting. Have you heard of that? This is where you get the same number of votes as there are seats open. So in this case, in the purple district in Florida, 6 seats are open. So you get 6 votes. But you can plump them on all 6 of them on one candidate if you want. Or you can put 3 on one, 2 on one, and 1 on another. You see where this is going? Yes. So groups that are traditionally underrepresented, they can strategize, and they can start plumping their votes on candidates that they feel will represent them better, and the chances of them getting elected, pretty good. Cumulative voting is not weird. Guess who uses cumulative voting in America? Corporate boards. That's how many of them elect their board members. Okay? So this isn't some sort of communist plot, all right? Moreover, lots of school districts and lots of local governments have used cumulative voting for years. So, I'm going to stop there because there's a lot we could do, but I want to see if there are a couple of questions before I ask Carrie to come up and maybe say a few words to let us go. First slide? Oh. First slide? I thought I answered those. Oh, yeah, you must have stepped out. So, yeah, 15 members of the House, U.S. House in Ohio, 33 Ohio senators, and 99 House members in the House. Yes?
I think if you had multiple people from a district, let's say you have 4 districts, and you have 28 people, I could see people not vetting the candidates.
Yeah.
And just, it'd be like a dartboard. Also, if you had most elections are alphabetical order, I can see people just marking the first 6 candidates. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be, I understand what you're saying, but I don't think people would take the time to vet that many candidates to try to get the best people elected.
That's a fair criticism. And I wonder if there would be 28 people running, But it's a fair criticism. Yeah. Fair enough. Dick, from a comparative perspective in other countries, what would you say about that?
Well, you could try, as other countries have done, and Volker could speak to this. You probably have to do some changing to the party systems to make it work. But parties can adopt slates of candidates and offer those, and you can also use a form of voting called proportional representation, which has lots of nuances, and some of it related to what Rob is talking about. But there are lots and lots of ways to go at this.
Yeah.
But they do involve significant changes in the way you think about parties and politics sometimes.
Yep. One more question before we close here. Yes, over here.
It's kind of responsive to what she said. Would it, and maybe this already exists, but would it be possible, I could continue to think about the concept of an informed electorate, for like a Secretary of State of whatever state to have like a cheat sheet and said, have something that you can pick up, and that maybe not on part of your palette, but say like candidate X, it has like a brief bio, there's their issues, you know, answer the same questions so that it can, well, I didn't get to vet all of them. I mean, but it could be available though, and that way if you got there and say, well,
At least it could be available. It's available now, pretty much. I mean, you know, newspapers do that, and the question is whether people really read that, and I think that's a fair question. Yeah, but yeah, teach in high school. Yeah, yes.
Let's say issue 1, by some miracle, does pass to end gerrymandering and create this commission. Currently, though, our Republican-led state legislature has a tendency to stop, block, and actually try and stop any changes to the Constitution. I mean, I'm thinking of issue 1 from last time.
Right.
Who can force them to do this, to honor the will of the people?
That's a great question. So there's a great book titled Stealing the Initiative, and it's about state ballot issues that people vote on and they think, all right, we passed it, it's going to happen. Well, the reason it's on the ballot is typically because the state government does not want to do it. And so they typically try to undermine it. There are two things that make it more likely that it's not going to be undermined. Number one, it's a constitutional amendment. And it's hard to undermine constitutional amendments, harder anyway, than it is to undermine statutory initiatives. Number two, though, the ability of people to see whether or not it's being complied with is easier when it's fairly clear what was supposed to happen. If a 15-member bipartisan commission is not created and they don't do what the issue said they were supposed to do, it's easier for people to see that as not happening and put pressure on the legislature to, you know, stop doing whatever funny business they might engage in to undermine it. It's the issues that are less clear, much more technically sophisticated, and more statutory oriented that tend to get undermined by state legislatures. In other words, get stolen by the state legislatures. So there's a possibility, but I think there's a good chance, because of those characteristics of this particular issue, that it would be obvious the shenanigans that were going on. Yes, there's a question here.
Ohio is the only state in the country whose current General Assembly was elected under maps where its own Supreme Court, declared to be unconstitutional. Are we the only state in the country where that's true?
Yes, we were with North Carolina, but North Carolina Supreme Court changed its partisan makeup and they approved their maps. So we are the only state under that scenario. One more. You have a lot of questions about this. I don't blame you.
Bad form, Jack. So along those lines, though, as I remember, in 2022, what happened is the state board said, oh, it's too late now, we're too close to the election, when the Supreme Court said these are still unconstitutional. Yeah. And they promised to change them for the next election. Has that happened?
That's underway. They're supposed to do that.
But we're in that election now, aren't we? Yeah. How many years does it take?
It hasn't happened, yeah. It hasn't happened. Remember, we had 2 primaries in 22. Remember that? In May, the state legislative and congressional seats were not on the ballot because the maps weren't ready. And then in August, they finally were put on the ballot with the unconstitutional maps that we then voted on. I don't know if you guys knew all that, but, and we're really getting into the weeds tonight, and there's a lot of stuff here, but there's a lot more information on fair districts on that website. There's more information on the Hagen Center if you want to dig into this a little bit more. But I appreciate your coming to these events. I'd like to ask Carrie to come up and just say a little bit, because she was behind the scenes putting a lot of this together. And I'd like to give her a hand, actually.
Well, thank you, but that is not the reason why I wanted to come up. I really wanted to come up to just thank all of you for being a part of this. I think this is indicative of what makes our community great. And I think that people all over the country should be envious of what we do when we come together. We can have civil, social, political conversations and make them meaningful. This never would have happened without coffee between Tracy and I one day. And Tracy, you have been behind this from the very start, and we thank you. And then we brought the brains into the situation. Bob actually guided this whole journey, and we were so grateful with Jessamy and with Chad. We could not have done this without the support of the Crable Foundation, without Springfield Foundation, and without Springfield News Sun. And Wittenberg has been a very generous sponsor of this event. So thank you all. The whole intention behind this was to get people knowledgeable and to go out, and what are we all going to do? Vote, and tell our friends to vote. So thank you, have a great night, and let's see when we can do this again.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody get out and vote and tell people to come and vote. And on the issue of voting, I know there's a lot of concern out there about allegations that our system is in trouble. But the Clark County Board of Elections is just trying to be as transparent as it can. And so they've got something called ballots backstage. Is that what they're calling it? So tomorrow at 2 p.m. and then on Thursday at 6 p.m., is that 6 p.m. Thursday? They're opening their back rooms. And if you want to go to the Board of Elections and have them give you a tour about how everything is done behind the scenes at the Board of Elections, that's what they're doing to try to make sure that everybody is clear about how the process works, at least here in Clark County. So that's called Ballot Backstage, tomorrow at 2 p.m. down at the Board of Elections, and then Thursday at 6 p.m. as well. So if you're interested, head over there. They'd be glad to show you around. Otherwise, anything for the good of the order? Yes.